The cruelest rooms are not always the ones with locked doors. Sometimes they are ballrooms full of smiling people who decide, quietly and all at once, that you do not belong. Evelyn Harper felt that truth the moment she stepped into the Grand Magnolia Hotel on Bay Street, where Savannah's old money had gathered beneath crystal chandeliers, and the soft gold light made every lie look expensive. The annual Civic Leadership Dinner was supposed to celebrate public service, neighborhood renewal, and the kind of charitable generosity people mentioned loudly enough for photographers to hear. Evelyn had not come for photographs. She had come because a cream-colored invitation had arrived at her small townhouse 2 weeks earlier, addressed simply to Ms. Evelyn Harper, and because some part of her, despite everything, still believed that showing up mattered. She wore a navy dress she had owned for 5 years, simple pearls that had belonged to her grandmother, and low heels practical enough to cross 3 downtown blocks without pretending pain was elegance. In her right hand, she carried a small black clutch. Inside it was a sealed envelope, heavier than it looked, though no one in that room knew why. At the registration table, a young volunteer glanced at her name tag, paused for half a second, then looked up with something close to recognition before quickly lowering her eyes and whispering, "Welcome, Ms. Harper." Evelyn gave her a small smile and moved toward the far side of the ballroom, where the round tables were arranged like tiny kingdoms, each one guarded by silverware, place cards, and ambition. That was when she heard the laugh. She knew it before she saw him. Grant Whitmore had always laughed as if the world were a private joke and everyone else was waiting for permission to understand it. He stood near the front of the room in a charcoal suit, one hand resting lightly on the back of Vanessa Cole, his new fiancée, who wore a pale champagne dress and the kind of diamond bracelet that announced itself before she did. Grant looked older than he had at the divorce hearing, but not humbler, because apparently time improves wine and ruins almost nothing in certain men. His eyes found Evelyn, traveled over her dress, her shoes, her unaccompanied entrance, and settled on her name tag with the satisfaction of a man discovering a weakness he could use in public. "Evelyn," he said, loud enough for the people around him to turn. "I didn't realize they were letting anyone buy a ticket this year." Vanessa's smile was delicate, practiced, and sharp at the edges. Evelyn stopped, not because the words surprised her, but because the room did. Conversations thinned. Glasses hovered near lips. A councilman she recognized from the newspaper glanced away, pretending sudden interest in the floral centerpiece. Grant stepped closer, lowering his voice only enough to make the insult feel intimate, while still giving the nearest table something to enjoy. "This is a civic leadership dinner," he said. "People here actually have status." For a second, the old reflex returned. The tightness in her chest, the heat rising beneath her skin, the memory of standing beside him at similar events, smiling while he introduced her as if she were a decorative fact of his life rather than a person. "My wife, Evelyn. She doesn't handle business." She remembered how easily people had accepted that version of her because it asked nothing of them. She remembered the day he left, the sterile conference room, the cold leather chair, his lawyer's fountain pen, and Grant's final little gift as he walked out. "Without my name, you're nobody." Now here he was again, offering the same sentence in a prettier room. Evelyn looked at him, then at Vanessa, then at the half circle of guests waiting for her to shrink. She did not explain herself. She did not defend her invitation. She did not reach into her clutch and pull out the envelope that could have changed every face in the room. Not yet. Instead, she placed one hand lightly over the clasp of her bag, lifted her chin, and said in a calm voice, "Good evening, Grant." That was all. 2 words. No apology. No wound placed on display for people who had not earned the right to see it. Grant's smile flickered, annoyed by the absence of collapse. Vanessa gave a soft laugh and leaned toward him, as if Evelyn were already fading from relevance. A hotel attendant appeared then and guided Evelyn toward a table near the back, not far from the service doors, where the music was quieter and the draft from the hallway brushed her ankles. Grant watched her go with that old, satisfied expression, certain he had put her where she belonged. Evelyn sat down alone, smoothed her napkin over her lap, and looked toward the front of the ballroom where the mayor's empty chair waited beneath the city seal. No one at Grant's table noticed the hospital director staring at Evelyn with sudden gratitude. No one noticed the school superintendent whispering her name. And no one, least of all Grant Whitmore, understood that before the night was over, the most powerful woman in the city would stand up for the woman he had just tried to erase. Evelyn's table was set for 10, but for several minutes, she sat there as if the chair beside her had been reserved for silence itself. The ballroom carried on without her in the polished way expensive rooms often do, pretending cruelty was only a social misunderstanding and that no one had hurt enough to be responsible. From the back of the room, Grant seemed smaller, not in importance, because men like him fed on attention the way fire fed on dry wood, but in truth. He moved from cluster to cluster with Vanessa on his arm, shaking hands, trading names, collecting smiles like receipts. Evelyn watched him perform the version of himself Savannah liked best, the generous developer, the civic-minded businessman, the man who could talk about affordable housing while planning condominiums most teachers, nurses, and city clerks could never afford. There had been a time when she had helped him polish those speeches at their kitchen island, replacing hard words with warm ones, teaching him how to sound as if he cared about streets he had only studied on zoning maps. Back then, he had called her eye for people sentimental. Later, when those same speeches opened doors for him, he called it instinct, naturally his own. A waiter approached with water and paused when he saw her face. He was young, maybe 22, with careful posture and nervous hands. "Ms. Harper," he said quietly, setting the glass down with unusual care. "My mother wanted me to thank you if I ever met you. She runs the after-school program on East 37th. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the edge of her napkin, not from fear this time, but from the ache of being recognized for something she had never intended to turn into currency. "How is she doing?" Evelyn asked. His face brightened. "Better. The new roof helped. The kids can use the art room again when it rains." He smiled once, quick and sincere, then returned to his work before anyone could notice the exchange. Across the room, Vanessa glanced toward Evelyn and frowned, as if gratitude were an accessory she had not approved. Evelyn looked down at her place card. Ms. Evelyn Harper. No company name beneath it. No title. No spouse. Nothing for people like Grant to measure quickly. That was the funny little sickness of rooms like this. Everyone wanted a label before deciding how much respect to spend. A few minutes later, Dr. Malcolm Pierce, the director of St. Anne's Hospital, crossed the ballroom with a glass of iced tea in his hand. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with silver hair and the tired eyes of someone who had spent too many years telling families difficult news. He stopped at Evelyn's table and bowed his head slightly. "Evelyn," he said, warm and low. "I was hoping you would come tonight." The woman seated 2 chairs away, who had been pretending not to notice Evelyn, suddenly became very interested. Evelyn stood halfway, but Dr. Pierce placed a gentle hand over his heart. "Please, do not get up for me. I should be the one standing for you." It was said softly, yet not softly enough. 2 people at the neighboring table turned. Grant saw it too. Evelyn could feel his attention sharpen across the room, thin and unpleasant as a draft under a closed door. "The pediatric wing opens next month," Dr. Pierce continued. "Because of you, there will be a family room on every floor." Evelyn shook her head almost imperceptibly. "Because of the board, and because your staff refused to give up. Because you made sure they did not have to," he said, and then, with the careful discretion of a man who understood promises, he moved on. Evelyn sat again, aware now that the air around her had changed. Not enough for a revelation. Not enough for applause. Just enough for suspicion. At the front of the room, Grant leaned toward a city council member, but his eyes kept slipping back to her. That was how it always began with men who believed they understood the hierarchy of the world. First, they ignored you. Then, when the wrong people greeted you with respect, they became curious. Evelyn picked up her water glass, took a slow sip, and let him wonder. Let him do math with missing numbers. Let him search his memory for a version of her he had never bothered to know. Then Mrs. Helen Crawford, superintendent of Savannah Public Schools, appeared beside Evelyn's chair with tears shining behind her glasses and said, "I promised myself I would not make a scene, but I cannot let this evening pass without thanking you." The room did not stop, not yet, but its rhythm faltered, like music missing a beat. Evelyn reached for the older woman's hand, and for the first time that night, Grant Whitmore looked uncertain. Mrs. Helen Crawford held Evelyn's hand for only a few seconds, but the gesture opened a door Evelyn had spent years keeping carefully closed. There was a time, not so long ago, when a woman like Helen would have been exactly the kind of person Grant wanted seated at his table, not because he cared about public schools, but because school districts own land, land had budgets, and budgets could be redirected by men who knew how to smile in the right committee rooms. Evelyn had learned that language during her marriage the way some people learn a second tongue, slowly, painfully, by listening more than she was allowed to speak. In the early years, before Grant became the polished man now performing beneath the chandeliers, he had been all restless energy and hunger, pacing their tiny rented duplex on the south side of Savannah with blueprints spread across the dining table and coffee going cold in chipped mugs. Evelyn had believed in him then. That was the detail that still embarrassed her, not because loving someone was foolish, but because she had mistaken ambition for vision. She had stayed up past midnight helping him rewrite proposals, correcting the tone of his letters, reminding him that neighborhoods were not empty squares on a map, but places where people kept birthday candles in kitchen drawers and measured their children's height on doorframes. Grant had laughed at that once and kissed the top of her head like she was charmingly naive. "That is why I need you," he had said. "You make me sound human." At the time, she had taken it as affection. Years later, she understood it as confession. When his first redevelopment bid succeeded, she was the one who remembered the city planner's wife was recovering from surgery and sent flowers. She was the one who noticed which council member hated being interrupted, which banker cared more about legacy than profit, which nonprofit director could open 3 doors with one phone call. Grant called it networking when he did it. When Evelyn did it, he called it being helpful. At dinners, he positioned her beside older donors and difficult spouses because she had the rare ability to make people feel seen without making them feel studied. Then, when the speeches came, he stood at the podium alone. "My wife keeps me grounded," he would say, and the room would smile at her as if she were a tasteful piece of furniture placed near the stage. She smiled back because that was what wives did in the version of life she had been handed. They softened corners. They remembered names. They disappeared at the exact moment applause began. The first time Grant introduced Vanessa Cole, she had been working as a communications consultant for one of his downtown projects. All bright confidence and perfectly timed laughter. Evelyn remembered Vanessa's hand in hers, cool and light, and the way Grant watched the younger woman speak with the fascinated attention he had stopped giving his own wife years before. Nothing improper happened in public. Men like Grant knew better than to be obvious before they had rewritten the story. First came the late meetings, then the sudden impatience, then the small corrections that landed like paper cuts. Evelyn was too quiet, too emotional, too attached to old neighborhoods, too uncomfortable in rooms where real decisions were made. The cruelest part was not that he changed. It was that he insisted she had imagined the man he used to be. By the time the marriage ended, Grant had already trained everyone around them to see Evelyn as the problem, a sweet woman perhaps, but not built for pressure, not sophisticated enough for the life he was leading. At the divorce hearing, he wore the same expression he wore tonight, patient, faintly wounded, publicly reasonable. His attorney spoke of incompatible priorities. Grant spoke of outgrowing the marriage. Evelyn said very little because she had not yet learned that silence could be power. Back then, it was only survival. She left with a modest settlement, a townhouse that needed repairs, and a sentence that followed her through every room for months. "Without my name, you are nobody." At the back table of the Grand Magnolia, with Helen Crawford still looking at her as if she had carried light into a dark school hallway, Evelyn felt that sentence loosen its grip by another inch. Across the ballroom, Grant was no longer laughing. He was watching the people come to her one by one, trying to understand how a woman he had taught himself to underestimate had become someone other people crossed crowded rooms to thank. Evelyn did not look away this time. She let him see her sitting there, calm and unadorned, no longer the wife who softened his image, no longer the shadow beside his ambition, but a woman he had never actually met. The evening had begun to gather around Evelyn in layers, not like attention yet, but like weather changing before a storm. At first, the people near her table only stole glances when they thought she would not notice. Then they began leaning toward one another, murmuring behind cocktail napkins and program booklets, trying to place her inside a system they understood. Was she a donor? A consultant? Someone's widow? Someone's mistake? The absence of a clear title made them restless. Evelyn had once been restless too, in the months after the divorce, when her life had been stripped down to cardboard boxes, a leaking kitchen sink, and a silence so complete she could hear the old house settling at night like it was sighing with disappointment. The townhouse she moved into was 860 square feet, with peeling white paint on the porch railing and a narrow backyard where weeds grew through the cracks in the brick path. Grant would have called it a downgrade. At the time, she almost believed him from a distance, which was one of the more tragic hobbies humans develop after being underestimated for too long. She spent the first winter there learning the shape of loneliness. The heater clicked loudly. Rain tapped against the back windows. Her phone stayed quiet except for utility reminders and the occasional message from people who wanted gossip disguised as concern. She took freelance work reviewing grant proposals for neighborhood nonprofits, not because it paid well, because it did not, but because words were still something she knew how to repair. One Tuesday morning in February, she met Laura Bennett at a community housing meeting in a church basement that smelled of coffee, dust, and floor wax. Laura was a single mother with 2 children, a tired smile, and a folder full of notices from a management company that had purchased her apartment building 3 months earlier. The rent increase was legal, technically, which was the phrase people used when something could be defended on paper but not in the heart. Laura worked 40 hours a week at a pharmacy and still could not keep up. "They say the building is being improved," Laura told Evelyn, her voice steady in the way voices become when tears are too expensive to spend. "But improvement just means we are supposed to leave before the paint dries." Evelyn remembered looking at the folder, at the children's school photos clipped inside, at the careful handwriting on every receipt Laura had saved. She saw then what Grant never had. A neighborhood was not a parcel. A home was not a unit. A family was not an obstacle to development. Evelyn did not have much money left, but she had enough to pay for a consultation with a housing attorney. She made 3 phone calls, edited 1 public comment letter, and spent 2 nights drafting a complaint that forced the management company to pause the eviction process. It was not a miracle. It was paperwork, patience, and one woman refusing to look away. Laura kept her apartment. Her children stayed in the same school. 2 weeks later, Laura brought Evelyn a paper bag of homemade blueberry muffins and cried on her porch steps, apologizing for crying, as if gratitude needed to behave itself. That was the first time Evelyn understood that the life Grant called small might be the only life in which she had ever done something that mattered. From there, the work grew quietly. A retired librarian needed help saving a reading program. A church needed emergency funds to keep its food pantry open through the summer. A youth center on East 37th needed a roof before hurricane season. Evelyn began connecting people who had resources with people who had been ignored by systems built to exhaust them. She learned which foundations had unused funds, which city forms could be appealed, which donors preferred anonymity, and which public promises could be turned into actual money if someone was stubborn enough to follow the paper trail. By the end of the 2nd year, the tiny account she managed from her kitchen table had become something larger than she had planned. By the 3rd, with the help of a retired accountant and a lawyer who believed in second chances, Harper Renewal Foundation became official. Evelyn refused a launch party. She refused a profile in the local magazine. She refused to put her photograph on the website. She had spent too many years being used as decoration in someone else's ambition to turn service into performance now. Back in the ballroom, Mrs. Crawford squeezed Evelyn's hand and whispered, "The library wing opens in September." The children voted to name the reading room after the person who saved it. Evelyn's throat tightened. "Please tell them not to use my name." Mrs. Crawford smiled gently. "They already chose one." Evelyn blinked. "What is it?" "The quiet light room." For the first time that night, Evelyn had to look away. Across the room, Grant watched her with growing irritation, because the woman he had dismissed was being honored in a language he did not speak. Grant Whitmore had never liked mysteries unless he was the one selling them to investors. From across the ballroom, he watched Evelyn accept Mrs. Crawford's gratitude with the same quiet expression she used to wear when listening to elderly neighbors talk too long at community meetings, patient, present, impossible to hurry. That used to irritate him. He had mistaken her patience for a lack of ambition because, naturally, human beings often call whatever they cannot exploit a weakness. Beside him, Vanessa touched his sleeve. Do you know why everyone keeps speaking to her? She asked, her voice smooth but thinner now. Grant forced a smile for the banker standing in front of him, then lowered his glass. It is Savannah. People are polite. Vanessa looked toward the back table again. That did not look polite. Grant did not answer. His eyes moved from Evelyn to Dr. Pierce, from Dr. Pierce to Helen Crawford, then to the young waiter who had just placed a dessert plate before Evelyn with the care usually reserved for governors and donors whose names were carved into marble. The evening was supposed to belong to him. He had spent 6 months preparing for this dinner, 6 months of lunches, calls, private tours, and carefully timed donations designed to position Whitmore Development as the obvious choice for the riverfront renewal project. The contract was worth more than $30 million over 5 years, but the money was only part of it. The project would place his company at the center of Savannah's future, the kind of civic achievement that made men look visionary in magazine profiles even when other people had supplied the vision. He had arrived believing Mayor Catherine Bell would notice him. He had rehearsed his remarks in the mirror of his downtown office, adjusting his tie, softening his smile, practicing sincerity the way other people practice piano. Vanessa had stood behind him that afternoon, reading from a tablet. Community first, she had said. Legacy over profit. Inclusive growth. Grant had repeated the phrases until they sounded almost real. Now, under the chandeliers, those words felt less steady. The people who mattered were not looking at him as often as they should have been. They were looking at Evelyn. Vanessa leaned closer. You told me she did not do anything after the divorce. Grant's jaw tightened. She did not. Then why does the hospital director speak to her like that? Malcolm Pierce thanks everyone. It is his whole personality. And the superintendent? Grant took a sip of water he did not want. Evelyn used to volunteer. She probably helped with some fundraiser. It sounded reasonable enough, which was fortunate, because reasonable lies were the ones that survived longest at dinner parties. Still, a small unease had begun to move through him. It was not guilt. Grant had never been fond of guilt. Guilt required a person to admit there had been another possible version of himself, one less selfish and more difficult to admire in a mirror. What he felt instead was irritation dressed as confusion. Evelyn was not following the script. She was supposed to sit at the back, wounded but composed, a tasteful reminder of his past, and nothing more. She was not supposed to become a question other people wanted answered. At the back table, Evelyn unfolded her program and saw the evening's agenda printed in navy ink. Welcome reception, dinner service, remarks from the civic board, presentation of the Riverfront Renewal Partnership, address from Mayor Catherine Bell. Her gaze stopped at the word renewal. It was such a clean word for something that could either heal a neighborhood or quietly remove the people who had made it worth saving. 5 years earlier, she might have heard Grant use that word and believed him. Now she knew renewal without protection was just displacement wearing a better suit. Her clutch rested beside her plate, the sealed envelope still inside. It contained a letter from the Harper Renewal Foundation Board, signed that morning, outlining conditions for their support of the city's Housing and Small Business Preservation Fund. Evelyn had not come to embarrass Grant. She had come to make sure the families on the riverfront were not turned into footnotes. A soft chime sounded from the stage as the event chair approached the microphone. Conversations faded by degrees. Grant straightened, preparing his face for importance. Evelyn sat quietly at the back table, hands folded, while the room turned toward the front. The mayor had not arrived yet, but the night had already begun shifting toward her. The event chair was a narrow man named Andrew Klein, a former bank executive with silver glasses and the kind of voice that made even thank you remarks sound like quarterly earnings. He welcomed the room, praised the sponsors, and spoke warmly about Savannah's future while servers moved between tables with plates of herb-roasted chicken, buttered green beans, and tiny squares of cornbread arranged, as if hunger itself had joined a planning committee. Evelyn listened, but her attention kept drifting to the sealed envelope in her clutch. Its edges pressed against the satin lining like a quiet pulse. Inside were not threats, not accusations, not some dramatic confession meant to humiliate anyone beneath the chandeliers. Evelyn had learned long ago that drama was often what people used when they had no structure. The letter was structure. It stated that Harper Renewal Foundation would commit $8 million over 4 years to protect riverfront renters, preserve small businesses, fund legal assistance for displaced families, and restore 3 historic blocks without forcing longtime residents out. It also stated, in language reviewed by 2 attorneys and 1 very patient retired judge, that no public-private partnership would receive foundation support unless the developer agreed to binding affordability protections, local hiring requirements, and independent oversight. Grant would hate every word of it, not because the conditions were unreasonable, but because they made him share control, and control had always been the altar where Grant Whitmore prayed. Evelyn remembered the day he toured the riverfront years earlier, before the divorce, before Vanessa, before his smile became something polished enough to cut. They had walked along the old brick warehouses near the water, past shrimp boats, antique shops, and a diner where dockworkers ate breakfast before sunrise. Grant had pointed toward a row of modest apartments and said, "Imagine what this could be worth if someone cleaned it up." Evelyn had looked at the laundry hanging from one balcony, the small herb garden on another, the elderly man sitting in a folding chair with a radio beside his knee. "It is already worth something," she had said. Grant had smiled at her in that affectionate, dismissive way that now lived in her memory like a stain. "You always think with your heart." At the time, she had not known how to answer. Now she knew the answer was simple. Someone had to. Andrew Klein continued at the podium, explaining the city's desire for a renewal model that honored history while inviting economic growth. Grant sat 2 tables from the stage, shoulders squared, face arranged into thoughtful concern. Vanessa watched him with a tight smile, sensing perhaps that something invisible had begun moving beneath the room. When Andrew mentioned Whitmore Development as one of the firms under consideration, polite applause rose from the front tables. Grant inclined his head with practiced humility. Evelyn noticed how naturally he accepted applause he had not yet earned. Then Andrew shifted to the community portion of the evening, introducing brief remarks from representatives of local institutions helped by private donors. The first was Dr. Pierce, who spoke of the hospital's pediatric wing and the importance of giving families dignity during long treatments. He did not say Evelyn's name. He had promised not to. But when he spoke of a donor who asked for no plaque, no photograph, and no public praise, his eyes moved briefly to the back of the room. Grant saw it. Evelyn saw him see it. Next came Mrs. Crawford, who described the reopening of 3 school libraries, including one that had been closed for nearly a decade due to roof damage and budget cuts. Her voice trembled when she spoke about children choosing books during the first week back, carrying them as carefully as treasure. "Some gifts do not simply buy materials," she said. "They return possibility." Again, she did not name Evelyn. Again, her gaze found her anyway. The murmuring grew softer now, not louder, which was how Evelyn knew people were truly paying attention. Noise was social. Silence was recognition beginning to take shape. At Grant's table, Vanessa leaned toward him and whispered something. Grant did not respond. His expression had hardened into the look he wore when a meeting stopped obeying him. Evelyn felt no triumph in that. Only a strange sadness, thin and cool. Once, she had wanted him to understand her. Now, understanding from Grant seemed like a door she no longer needed to open. Andrew returned to the microphone and glanced toward the ballroom entrance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "Mayor Bell has arrived." The room shifted instantly. Chairs scraped softly against the carpet. Napkins were placed aside. Grant stood with everyone else, smoothing his jacket, already turning toward the aisle with his hand prepared for the greeting he believed was coming. Evelyn remained seated for 1 breath longer, not out of disrespect, but because her knees had gone suddenly weak beneath the table. At the far end of the ballroom, the double doors opened, and Mayor Catherine Bell entered in a deep blue suit, her white hair swept back, her presence calm enough to quiet the room without asking. She greeted Andrew first, then the council president, then took 2 steps toward the front. Grant moved slightly into her path, smiling with all the careful warmth he had rehearsed. But the mayor's eyes passed over him, stopped, and fixed on the back table. Evelyn felt the entire room tilt toward her. Mayor Catherine Bell did not hurry, which somehow made the moment worse for everyone who had been expecting politics to behave like choreography. She stood near the entrance for 1 measured second, her gaze fixed past the donors, past the city council members, past Grant Whitmore's extended hand, all the way to the back table where Evelyn Harper sat with her fingers resting lightly against her water glass. Grant's smile held for half a heartbeat too long, then stiffened at the edges. A man could survive being ignored by a stranger, but being passed over by someone whose approval he had spent months pursuing was a different kind of public education. The room watched as Mayor Bell stepped around him with the calm precision of a woman who had spent 30 years in public life and had learned exactly when silence could do more work than any speech. Vanessa's hand slipped from Grant's arm. Andrew Klein froze beside the microphone, one hand still holding his note cards. Chairs creaked as people turned, their curiosity now too obvious to disguise as politeness. Evelyn felt heat rise to her face, not from shame this time, but from the sudden terror of being seen after so many years of choosing usefulness over attention. She had met Catherine Bell 4 years earlier in a conference room above the old municipal building, back when the mayor was still a councilwoman fighting a losing battle to keep a women's shelter from closing. Evelyn had not introduced herself as anyone important. She had arrived with a binder, a list of donors, and a plan that looked boring enough to work, which is how most miracles arrive when adults are involved. Catherine had listened for 20 minutes, then asked, "Why are you doing this?" Evelyn had answered with the only truth she had at the time. "Because someone should have helped me before I learned how to help myself." They had not become friends exactly. Friendship was too casual a word for what grew between them. It was trust, built in grant applications, late phone calls, emergency meetings, and the quiet relief of watching families keep their homes because paperwork had finally been forced to serve people instead of bury them. Now Catherine crossed the ballroom toward her, and with every step, another conversation died. Grant did not move. For once, he seemed unable to decide which version of himself the room required. The confident developer? The wounded ex-husband? The civic leader denied his moment? None of them fit. Evelyn rose as the mayor approached, because whatever else she had become, her grandmother had raised her to stand when someone came to greet her. But Mayor Bell reached her first and took both of Evelyn's hands in hers. The gesture was warm, public, unmistakable. "Evelyn," she said, and her voice carried farther than it should have in a room that had forgotten how to breathe. "I was afraid you might slip out before I had the chance to thank you properly." Evelyn tried to smile. "Madam Mayor, this is your evening." Catherine shook her head. "No. This evening exists because people like you kept doing the work when there were no cameras, no headlines, and no applause waiting at the end of it." A murmur passed through the ballroom like wind through dry leaves. Evelyn glanced toward Grant before she could stop herself. His face had gone pale beneath the warm light, his expression caught between disbelief and calculation. He was searching for an explanation that would let him keep the story he preferred. Maybe Evelyn had exaggerated her role. Maybe the mayor was being sentimental. Maybe this was some small nonprofit courtesy, one of those sweet civic gestures that looked meaningful but carried no real weight. Then Mayor Bell turned, still holding Evelyn's hand, and faced the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "before I take the stage, there is someone here tonight who should never have been seated at the back of this ballroom." The words landed softly, which made them brutal. Andrew Klein swallowed. Mrs. Crawford pressed a hand to her chest. Dr. Pierce lowered his eyes with the faintest smile. Evelyn wanted to tell Catherine not to do this, not because Grant deserved protection, but because she had spent years learning the peace of not needing anyone's permission to matter. Yet the mayor's hand remained steady around hers, and Evelyn understood this was no longer about pride. It was about every person in the room who had mistaken humility for emptiness. Catherine looked directly toward Grant then, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the devastating courtesy public officials reserve for men who have just stepped into a lesson wearing expensive shoes. "Savannah owes Ms. Harper more than a place card," she said. "It owes her a standing ovation." For one suspended second, no one moved. The request had been too simple to misunderstand and too public to ignore. Then Dr. Malcolm Pierce rose from his chair near the front, slow and deliberate, his hands coming together in applause that sounded almost startling in the stillness. School board member, then 2 nurses from St. Anne's Hospital, then the young waiter at the service wall who seemed to forget entirely that he was supposed to remain invisible. The applause spread unevenly at first, like rain beginning on a tin roof, then stronger, fuller, until the Grand Magnolia Ballroom filled with the sound of people recognizing what pride had almost made them miss. Evelyn stood beside Mayor Bell, her face composed but her eyes shining. She had imagined many difficult endings to this night. She had imagined Grant cornering her with one more polished insult, Vanessa laughing behind a crystal glass, or some donor asking which table she really belonged to. She had not imagined standing at the back of a ballroom while the people she had helped quietly over the years rose for her in front of the man who had once told her she was nobody. Grant remained standing too, though not by choice in any meaningful sense. The entire room was on its feet, and sitting would have required a level of honesty he had not yet developed. His hands came together twice, stiffly, without rhythm. Vanessa did not clap at first. She stared at Evelyn as if trying to identify the exact moment the evening had stopped flattering her. Then, seeing the eyes around her, she raised her hands and joined in, her bracelets flashing under the chandeliers like tiny warning lights. Evelyn wished, absurdly, for her grandmother's old kitchen instead of this room. She wished for the smell of biscuits cooling on a wire rack, for the soft scrape of a wooden chair on linoleum, for a place where goodness did not have to be announced before people believed in it. But Mayor Bell squeezed her hand, grounding her, and leaned close enough that only Evelyn could hear. "Let them give this to you," she said. "You have spent long enough giving without being seen." That nearly undid her. Not the applause. Not Grant's stunned face. That sentence. Because being unseen had once felt like safety. After the divorce, invisibility had been a shelter, a way to rebuild without commentary, without pity, without people measuring her recovery against his version of the story. She had become skilled at doing good. From the margins, sending checks through attorneys, signing donor forms through the foundation office, attending meetings by phone, declining photographs, declining interviews, declining any room where gratitude might turn into performance. But there was a cost to hiding even from praise. A person could become so determined not to need validation that they accidentally taught the world to withhold it. Mayor Bell seemed to know that. The applause finally softened, then faded into a charged silence. Catherine guided Evelyn toward the front, not with force, but with the quiet certainty of someone restoring an object to its proper place. Evelyn walked beside her through the narrow aisle between tables, past the councilman who had looked away earlier, past donors who now lowered their eyes with embarrassed respect, past Grant's table where Vanessa's perfume hung sweet and sharp in the air. Grant caught Evelyn's gaze as she passed. For once, he had no ready sentence, no charming correction, no public version of events already prepared. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, and Evelyn saw something flicker behind his eyes that might have been regret, or calculation trying on regret's coat. She did not stop. At the stage, Andrew Klein stepped aside so quickly he nearly dropped his note cards, because human dignity is apparently easier to recognize when a mayor points at it. Catherine led Evelyn to the microphone, but did not ask her to speak. Every person in the ballroom to feel the shape of what had been hidden from them, and then she began naming it. Not with theatrical drama, not with the inflated language of donors who liked their generosity wrapped in velvet, but with the steady clarity of someone placing records on a table where no one could pretend not to see them. 4 years ago, she said, when the Harbor House shelter was within 30 days of closing, a private citizen organized emergency funding, legal review, and a volunteer repair team before the city even had time to schedule a hearing. Evelyn stood beside her, hands folded, eyes lowered, feeling each sentence arrive like a door opening behind her. 3 years ago, when St. Anne's Hospital needed family rooms for parents sleeping in chairs beside sick children, that same citizen helped secure the first round of matching funds. Dr. Pierce bowed his head. 2 years ago, when 3 school libraries were closed because of storm damage and budget shortages, she helped bring them back. Mrs. Crawford pressed a handkerchief beneath her glasses. Around the room, people began putting pieces together with the slow discomfort of those realizing they had been clapping for buildings without asking who had kept the lights on. Grant's face had become unreadable, which meant he was working very hard to read everyone else. Evelyn knew that look. It was the expression he used in negotiations when a number had shifted against him and he needed to discover whether charm could still lower the price. Mayor Bell turned slightly toward Andrew Klein, who handed her a blue folder embossed with the city seal. Tonight, I am also pleased to announce that Harper Renewal Foundation has submitted a formal partnership proposal to support the Riverfront Renewal Project with $8 million over the next 4 years. A sharper murmur moved through the room. $8 million had a remarkable way of improving people's posture. Grant's head lifted. Vanessa's eyes widened, then narrowed, not at the amount, but at the name. Harper. Evelyn's name. No husband's name attached. No Whitmore shadow clinging to the end of it like an old stain. Mayor Bell continued, this proposal includes funding for renter protections, small business preservation grants, neighborhood legal aid, and historic restoration that keeps longtime residents in place. She paused, and the pause was so precise it felt almost surgical. It also requires any development partner to accept independent oversight and binding affordability standards. Grant's fingers tightened around the back of his chair. There it was. Not revenge. Not humiliation. Something far worse for a man like him. Accountability in writing. Evelyn could almost hear his thoughts forming, racing through angles, exceptions, quiet calls to board members, perhaps a private apology if it could still be converted into advantage. The Riverfront Renewal Project, the prize he had spent half a year circling, now stood behind a gate he did not control. And the woman holding the key was the one he had placed at the back table. Mayor Bell looked toward Evelyn. Miss Harper did not ask me to say any of this. In fact, she asked me many times not to. A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the room, softened by respect. Evelyn allowed herself the smallest smile, because that much was true enough to be inconvenient. But public work deserves public truth, the mayor said. And the truth is that Savannah has been changed by a woman who never needed a spotlight to do powerful things. Evelyn lifted her eyes then, and for a moment she saw not the chandeliers, not the donors, not Grant's stunned expression, but the faces behind the work. Laura Bennett's children carrying backpacks up the stairs to the apartment they had not lost. A little girl at St. Anne's asleep in a chair beside her father because the family room was not finished yet, but would be soon. Children walking into the quiet light room and running their hands over new books as if touching a future they had been promised too late. That was what the money meant. Not status, not applause, not a photograph in a magazine someone would recycle by spring. It meant people stayed, people healed, people learned. People were not pushed aside because a cleaner version of the city looked better in a brochure. Mayor Bell stepped back from the microphone and faced Evelyn fully. Would you like to say a few words? The room waited. Grant waited too, though for a different reason. He needed to hear her voice now, needed to measure the woman he had dismissed against the power she had quietly built. Evelyn approached the microphone, feeling the cool metal beneath her fingertips. Her voice, when it came, was calm. I did not start this work because I had status, she said. I started because I knew what it felt like to lose a home inside your own life, and I did not want other people to go through that alone. The ballroom stayed utterly still. If this city has given me any place at all, she continued, then I hope it is only this. Beside the people who are too often asked to disappear quietly. Then she stepped back, leaving Grant with nothing to attack, nothing to mock, and no version of her small enough to fit inside his old story. The applause after Evelyn's brief statement did not rise immediately. It came slowly, almost carefully, as if the room understood that clapping too loudly would turn the moment into entertainment, and something about her voice had made entertainment feel cheap. People stood again, but this time the sound was softer, more respectful, less about surprise and more about admission. Evelyn stepped back from the microphone and felt the weight of the evening settle into her shoulders. She had not said much, yet the words had opened years of silence with the clean precision of a key turning in a lock. Mayor Bell touched her elbow and guided her toward the side of the stage, where Andrew Klein was waiting with the expression of a man whose printed agenda had just been politely run over by history. He recovered quickly, because civic dinners are nothing if not exercises in pretending that unexpected truth was part of the schedule all along. Thank you, Miss Harper, he said into the microphone, his voice noticeably warmer than it had been earlier. And thank you, Madam Mayor, for reminding us what leadership often looks like before anyone thinks to name it. Evelyn heard the sentence, but did not absorb it. Her attention had shifted to Grant. He was standing at his table, one hand on the back of his chair, his face arranged into something that might have passed for admiration if she had not spent 12 years learning the tiny differences between his public masks. This was not admiration. This was arithmetic. $8 million. Binding oversight. Affordability protections. The mayor's public respect. The rooms changed opinion. Evelyn could almost see him adding, subtracting, searching for the path that left him least diminished. Vanessa stood beside him, her smile gone now, replaced by a bright, brittle stillness. She leaned toward him and whispered, "You said she had nothing." Grant's eyes stayed on Evelyn. "I thought she did." There it was, the tragedy of Grant Whitmore in 4 small words. He had thought not knowing something meant it did not exist. Mayor Bell returned to the microphone to continue the formal program, but the energy in the ballroom had changed beyond repair. Grant's name no longer floated above the evening like a promise. It sat there like a question waiting for paperwork. When the mayor spoke about the Riverfront Renewal Project, she did not mention Whitmore Development first. She spoke of families, local businesses, historic preservation, and enforceable community protections. She spoke of a city that could grow without asking its most vulnerable people to vanish for the comfort of brochures. Every sentence seemed to tighten the invisible net around Grant's ambition. Evelyn listened from a seat near the stage now, where Mayor Bell had quietly placed her, not at the center, but no longer hidden by the service doors. The view from the front was strange. She could see the whole ballroom, the shimmer of silverware, the small social calculations on faces, the way people turned toward whoever held power at a given moment, as naturally as flowers turned toward sunlight. She wondered how many years she had spent confusing that motion for respect. Respect, she understood now, was not the same as attention. Attention could be bought with a table sponsorship, a tailored suit, a donation announced at the right volume. Respect was slower. It was built in calls answered after hours, in promises kept when no one was filming, in names remembered after the check cleared. As the dinner resumed, people approached Evelyn one by one, not crowding her, not making a spectacle, but offering quiet thanks. A woman from the Housing Coalition told her that 6 families had stayed in their apartments because of the emergency fund. A small business owner from River Street said her bakery had survived after the foundation helped with storm repairs. A retired teacher pressed Evelyn's hand and said, "My students have books again." Each sentence landed deeper than applause. Grant watched all of it. He watched the room gather around the woman he had tried to place beneath him, and for the first time that night, he seemed to understand that he had not merely misjudged Evelyn's status. He had misunderstood the entire meaning of it. When the dessert plates were cleared and the guests began drifting toward coffee and conversation, Evelyn finally stepped away from the stage area toward the quiet side hallway near the ballroom entrance. She needed air, or at least a few feet of space where no one was thanking her with tears in their eyes. She had just reached the marble corridor when Grant's voice came behind her, lower than before, stripped of its performance. "Evelyn." She stopped, not because the name still held power, but because running from it no longer did. Grant's voice followed Evelyn into the marble corridor with none of the easy command it used to carry. It sounded smaller out there, away from the chandeliers and applause, stripped of the room that had been feeding it all night. Evelyn turned slowly. Behind him, the ballroom doors remained half open, leaking warm light, piano music, and the low hum of people pretending not to watch while absolutely watching. Because privacy is a noble idea, humans abandon the moment something interesting happens. Grant stood a few feet away, his jacket buttoned, his tie still perfect, his face less so. For the first time in years, he looked like a man who had misplaced the script and discovered the audience could still see him. "I did not know," he said. Evelyn studied him without anger. That surprised her more than anything. She had imagined this moment before, not exactly like this. Not with a mayor and $8 million and half of Savannah rearranging its opinion in real time, but some version of it. In the early months after the divorce, she had imagined Grant seeing her pain and finally understanding what he had done. Later, she imagined him regretting her. Then, after a while, she stopped imagining him at all, which turned out to be the first sign of recovery, though no one puts that on greeting cards. Now he stood in front of her, offering the one sentence men often reach for when truth arrives wearing witnesses. "I did not know." As if ignorance were an apology. As if not looking could wash a person clean of what they refused to see. "No," Evelyn said quietly. "You did not." Grant swallowed, glancing once toward the ballroom, where Vanessa lingered near their table, rigid with embarrassment and curiosity. "You could have told me," he said. There it was, the old reflex, delicate as a silver knife. Even now, somehow, The responsibility was trying to walk back into her hands. Evelyn almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because it was familiar. Told you what, Grant? That schools needed libraries? That families needed homes? That hospital rooms needed space for parents to sleep? You knew those things existed. You just did not think they mattered unless they helped you win something. His expression tightened. That is not fair. It is accurate. The words came without heat, which made them land cleaner. Grant looked down the corridor, then back at her. I said something careless tonight. You said something honest. He flinched, not dramatically, just enough for her to see the sentence find him. Evelyn rested one hand against her clutch, feeling the envelope still inside. The foundation letter that had changed the direction of the evening without ever raising its voice. You always respected rooms more than people, she said. If the right person stood at a podium, you listened. If the right name was on a building, you admired it. If the right donor entered the room, you smiled. But when someone had no title you could use, no money you could count, no status you recognized, you treated them as if they were invisible. Grant's eyes lowered for the first time. I was wrong about you. The sentence should have felt larger. Once it would have. Once, she might have carried those 6 words home like proof that the years had not been wasted, that the wound had finally been witnessed by the man who made it. But standing there in the corridor of the Grand Magnolia, Evelyn realized she no longer needed him to name what she already knew. You were, she said. But that is not the important part. He looked up, confused. Then what is? Evelyn's voice softened, not for his sake, but for her own. The important part is that I was wrong about me when I believed you. Beyond the doors, someone laughed gently, and the sound floated into the hall like life continuing because, inconveniently, it always does. Grant had no answer. Maybe there was none. Maybe some conversations are not meant to repair the past, only to prove that the past has lost its right to enter every room first. Evelyn stepped closer, close enough that he had to meet her eyes. I do not hate you, Grant. That would require a level of attention I cannot afford anymore. His mouth parted slightly, almost wounded by the absence of hatred, because hatred at least would have kept him important. But I will not soften what you did just because you are uncomfortable seeing what I became without you. He nodded once, barely. From inside the ballroom, Mayor Bell's voice rose at the microphone, calling for the Riverfront Advisory members to gather after dinner. Evelyn turned toward the sound. Grant said her name again, but this time it did not stop her. She looked back only once. You only respected me after someone powerful told you to, she said. That was never my lack of status. It was your lack of vision. Then she walked past him toward the ballroom doors, not triumphant, not cruel, simply free, which was apparently the most devastating thing she could have chosen to be. Evelyn stepped back into the ballroom with Grant's unfinished apology still cooling behind her in the marble corridor. The room did not turn all at once this time. It had already learned the danger of underestimating quiet movement. Instead, people made space for her in small, respectful ways. A chair pulled back, a path cleared, a nod offered without performance. Mayor Bell stood near the front with a small group from the Riverfront Advisory Committee, her blue folder open on the table, the city seal catching the chandelier light. When she saw Evelyn approach, she did not wave her over like a guest being summoned. She simply shifted to make room, as if Evelyn's place in the conversation had been waiting all along. We were just discussing the first public listening session, the mayor said. I would like it held in the Riverfront neighborhood, not here, not at City Hall, not somewhere people have to pay $20 to park before they can tell us what they need. Evelyn nodded, feeling something inside her settle. Then hold it at the community center on Abercorn. It seats 200, the bus stop is half a block away, and Mrs. Alvarez will make sure everyone eats if we cover the groceries. Mayor Bell smiled. That is exactly why you are in this room. Across the ballroom, Grant remained near the corridor entrance, watching but no longer approaching. Vanessa stood beside him now, her expression tight, her earlier confidence folded away like a dress returned to a garment bag after a disappointing evening. Evelyn felt no need to study them. Their world had not ended. Men like Grant rarely lost everything in one night, despite what dramatic people and cheaper screenplays prefer. He would still have money, contacts, and a talent for sounding sincere when cornered. But something essential had shifted. The city had seen him look past the very people he claimed to serve. Worse for him, It had seen Evelyn refuse to become cruel in return. That was a kind of defeat no public relations consultant could easily repair. The meeting lasted only 15 minutes, just long enough to set dates, assign review steps, and make Andrew Klein promise, with visible discomfort, that the Foundation's conditions would be included in the formal minutes. Evelyn signed nothing that night. She had learned patience from institutions designed to test it. But when she finally placed the sealed envelope into Mayor Bell's hands, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a door closing exactly where it should. Afterward, as guests drifted toward the exits and the ballroom lost its polished intensity, Evelyn found herself alone for a moment beside one of the tall windows. Outside, Savannah glowed under street lamps, oak branches stirring above parked cars, the air beyond the glass warm with the kind of night that smelled faintly of rain and river water. She thought of her old townhouse, the repaired porch railing, the narrow backyard where she had planted rosemary and mint, the kitchen table where the Foundation had begun with a second-hand laptop, and a fear she refused to obey. She thought of Laura Bennett's muffins in a paper bag, of children naming a reading room the Quiet Light Room, of hospital families who would never know her face and did not need to. For years, Grant's sentence had lived somewhere in her body, not loudly, but persistently. Without my name, you are nobody. Tonight had not erased it with applause. Healing was not that theatrical, because life, annoyingly, is not edited by people with decent pacing. But the sentence had changed. It no longer sounded like truth. It sounded like a man describing the limits of his own imagination. Mayor Bell joined her by the window, holding 2 cups of coffee from the service table. She handed one to Evelyn. You handled him with more grace than most people would have. Evelyn accepted the cup, smiling faintly. Grace is cheaper than legal fees. Catherine laughed, soft and genuine. Still, Evelyn looked back at the ballroom, at the emptying tables, at Grant leaving through the side door with Vanessa a step ahead of him. I spent too many years wanting him to see me, she said. Tonight, I realized the people who needed me already did. Mayor Bell raised her cup slightly, not quite a toast, more a recognition. That is status, Evelyn. Evelyn looked out at the city again. No, she said gently. That is responsibility. And perhaps that was the difference Grant had never understood. Status was something people chased across rooms, polished and fragile, dependent on who was watching. Responsibility was quieter. It stayed after the gala ended, after the flowers wilted, after the applause became memory. It stood in classrooms, shelters, hospital halls, and neighborhoods where people were tired of being treated like obstacles to someone else's future. Evelyn finished her coffee, gathered her clutch, and walked out through the front doors of the Grand Magnolia without waiting to see who noticed. The night air touched her face like a blessing. She had entered the room as a woman someone tried to diminish. She left as herself, which was more than enough. The next morning, Savannah looked ordinary again, which felt almost rude after the previous night had rearranged so many invisible things. Sunlight slid across Evelyn's kitchen floor in pale gold strips, touching the chipped corner of the table where Harper Renewal Foundation had begun with a laptop, a stack of unpaid invoices, and one woman too tired to keep believing she was powerless. The house smelled of coffee, rosemary from the backyard, and rain left behind in the soil. Evelyn stood barefoot at the counter, reading the local news on her phone while the coffee maker sputtered like an old man arguing with Monday. The headline did not use her name first, for which she was grateful. City announces $8 million community partnership for riverfront renewal. Beneath it was a photograph from the dinner, Mayor Bell at the microphone, Evelyn standing beside her in navy, looking calmer than she had felt. The article mentioned Harper Renewal Foundation, the affordability conditions, the small business grants, the public listening sessions, and the mayor's promise that development would not move faster than the people it affected. It also mentioned Whitmore Development only once, politely, in a paragraph about firms still under review. Evelyn imagined Grant reading that part over breakfast and discovering that relevance, much like fine china, could crack without making much noise. Her phone buzzed with messages. Dr. Pierce sent a simple thank you. Mrs. Crawford sent a photograph of a handmade sign the children had taped to the library door. Laura Bennett sent 3 heart emojis and then, because Laura was still Laura, a warning that Evelyn had better come by. For muffins before noon. Evelyn smiled, then set the phone face down. Praise was a warm thing, but if held too long, it could start to feel like another room expecting performance. She poured coffee into a chipped blue mug and stepped onto the back porch. The mint had spread aggressively again, because apparently even herbs developed empire-building tendencies when left unsupervised. For a while, she listened to the city waking up. A delivery truck groaned somewhere down the block. A dog barked once and reconsidered. Wind moved through the live oaks with a sound like pages turning. She thought about Grant in the corridor, the confusion in his face when she refused to hate him properly. There had been a time when she believed healing would feel like victory over him. She had pictured some grand reversal, some clean moment where shame changed sides and finally left her body. But real healing had been stranger, quieter, and far less interested in theatrical timing. It was realizing she could remember his words without obeying them. It was walking into a room where he stood and not becoming smaller. It was accepting that some people would only value her after authority translated her worth into a language they respected, and that their delay did not reduce the truth. By 9 o'clock, Evelyn arrived at the community center on Abercorn Street, carrying a folder, 2 pens, and no entourage, because human beings had already invented enough unnecessary ceremonies. The building was plain brick with a faded mural on one side and a front ramp that needed repainting. Inside, Mrs. Alvarez was taping a handwritten sign to the wall. Riverfront listening session, Saturday, 10 in the morning. Children's corner available. Coffee and breakfast provided. You are early, Mrs. Alvarez said, not turning around. You are bossy, Evelyn replied. That is why this works. Mrs. Alvarez laughed and handed her a roll of tape. For the next hour, they arranged folding chairs in rows of 20, checked the microphone, moved the sign-in table closer to the entrance, and debated whether 200 muffins would be enough for a neighborhood meeting. Evelyn suspected it would not. Around 10:15, Mayor Bell arrived without cameras, wearing flats and carrying a box of file folders. She looked at the chairs, the sign, the coffee urn, then at Evelyn. This feels better than the Grand Magnolia, she said. Evelyn glanced around the room, at the scuffed floor, the fluorescent lights, the community bulletin board crowded with lost pet flyers, tutoring notices, and church fish fry announcements. It is better, she said. People can tell the truth here. By noon, the first residents began stopping by just to ask if the meeting was real. An older man from River Street wanted to know whether renters would actually be heard. A bakery owner asked if grants would include storm repairs. A young mother asked whether she could bring her children because childcare was expensive and city meetings always seemed designed by people who had forgotten children existed. Evelyn answered each question carefully. No promises she could not keep. No polished phrases. No performance. Just the work, patient and unglamorous, which was where every meaningful change eventually had to live. That afternoon, as she locked the community center doors, her phone buzzed once more. A message from an unknown number appeared. It was Grant. I understand more now. I am sorry. Evelyn read it twice. Then she slipped the phone into her bag without replying. Some apologies were doors. Some were windows. Some were only echoes arriving after the house had already been rebuilt. She walked to her car beneath the wide Georgia sky, carrying the folder against her chest, thinking not of the ballroom, not of applause, not of the man who had once confused her silence with emptiness. She thought of Saturday morning, of 200 chairs, of families who would walk through those doors expecting to be ignored and instead find coffee, paperwork, witnesses, and a woman at the front of the room ready to listen. That was enough. More than enough. The life Grant had called small had become wide enough to hold a city's future.